Hello, everyone, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National, and it is great to have you here with us today for our show. As always, I am joined by our leader and my good friend and colleague, Jean Marie Nevada. Oh, what is going on right now? What is that? You have a peacock on your lap, Jean Marie.
It's Pride Month, Liz.
Oh.
We're getting started in Pride Month. There will be many costumes, headgear, and things to follow. We need to show some joy.
I am all here for the joy. I'm so ready for it.
I also appreciate how I never tell the Director of Communications what I'm doing until we're on air.
No, or I find out when there's a mass need for crisis communications because of something Jean Marie did. So it all works out in the end.
Thank you, Liz. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. Every single week we get together, until I behave badly, to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And we always like inviting a few friends along to have the conversation. And this week we are talking about one of my very favorite topics in the entire universe, the thing I enjoy teaching more than anything else, and that is LGBTQ history and culture. We're using an article this week that appeared in The Advocate, written by Trudy Ring, and it was specifically about a bill that was recently signed into law in Tennessee that does many horrific things, up to and including a very, very difficult situation when it comes to curriculum that is LGBTQ inclusive and fair. And so to have this conversation, I will tell you, we had two guests planned, but we are having some crazy technical issues today. So I'm going to bring in our guest who is with us, and we're going to do another show at another time on this one. And my guest for today is Deborah Fowler, the Executive Director of History Unerased.
Hello, everyone. It is
Hey, Deborah.
Hi. I loved your intro, Jean Marie. That was great.
The fan. I think the fan is necessary. We all need more fans in our lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you today. It is a privilege and an honor. Happy Pride, everyone. So let's dive right in.
And I'm so excited to talk to you. This show has just given me an ability to connect with people whose work I have followed, and I've been looking at what you've been doing with History Unerased, and this is so exciting. So, we have some questions based on the article, but I think we can take this conversation wherever we want to, and I'm sure that you and I have a few opinions on the topic.
Oh, certainly we do.
So, the bill that was signed in Tennessee essentially would give parents the right to opt out of any curriculum that includes LGBTQ people. They have a 30-day notice, and this does not just apply to health curriculum. This could theoretically apply to pretty much anything. But I want to kind of go back a little bit, because the past few years we've seen some pretty nice progress when it comes to inclusive curriculum. States like California and New Jersey have mandated that inclusion of LGBTQ individuals happen in public school curriculum. So do you think that bills like what just happened in Tennessee, and that's not the only one, there are certainly other ones, pose a threat to the progress that's happening? And do you think these bills are a reaction to that, or do you think it's part of a bigger effort?
Well, I can tell you that, it is important to note that since January, over 100 AntiTrans bills have been introduced, and there are probably myriad reasons for that. It's by design. And what is so deeply concerning for me, and I want to put this out there, and I'm sure all of you who are attending right now share this concern, is that irrespective of whether the bill passes, like in Tennessee, the governor signed it, what is being conveyed to young people that these are even introduced is deeply concerning. And what that message is conveying to them about LGBTQ plus identities. And what happened with the governor in Tennessee signing that bill, it is egregious. And I don't know if it is in response to mandated state policy, such as you mentioned in California and New Jersey and others, with Colorado and Illinois. But the call to action is loud and clear. And that, as community members, we know, and again, all of you here today certainly know that Policy shifts are one thing. Shifting hearts and minds, it's oftentimes a long game. But with those states that do have mandated policy for LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, it's vital, it's critical. And I talk to educators all day, every day in the work that I do. And that policy piece is hugely important. So whether it is mandating LGBTQ inclusive curriculum or it is antithetical to what those mandated policies are trying to accomplish, policy is kind of the stake in the ground, and how it's talked about is really important too.
It very much is. I remember in the previous administration with some of the attacks that were going on with Title IX, reading a statistic that Trevor Project actually saw a spike in crisis calls after some of the announcements about things that are happening in schools were announced. Mm-hmm. And it really stuck with me. You kind of wonder, is everyone paying attention? And young people who are queer are definitely paying attention, and it has an immediate impact on them. So before I go any further, for people who don't know about History Unerased, could you tell people a little bit about your work? Because I think it'll give context to the rest of our conversation.
Sure. So I'm a co-founder and current executive director of History Unerased. Also a former, as I like to say, boots on the ground, in the trenches classroom teacher. And History Unerased was co-founded in 2015. And our mission is putting LGBTQ history in its rightful place, the classroom. And we work with K-12 schools, providing them with intersections and connections curriculum, supplemental U.S. history curriculum that's merged with the professional development training. And we offer many different supports to provide ongoing mentorship and sustainability for that. So it's merging the instructional resources and the professional learning and the ongoing sustainable support so that teachers are proficient and confident and well supported in doing this work.
And I think that's so important because I think both of my parents were teachers, they're retired now. And I think so much is asked of teachers, but unless you're providing them with the guidance on how to get from point A to point B, they're often being asked to do a lot. And unless there are supports exactly like what you were describing, it gets really difficult. So I want to talk a little bit about what this impact of first being seen and sometimes when we're not seen actually looks like. And you've been in classrooms, you have been working with educators and with students. So what do you think the impact is when we start saying to kids, we're not going to address this, or your parents will have the ability to opt you out of these kind of classes? What is happening in that educational environment when things like this occur, when they are introduced and when they are pushed?
Well, there are so many different answers to that because every context is a little bit different. Right now, we are in the midst of working with an elementary school, working with the full staff and the administration and the parents. And the way that we approach having conversations about this and hearing from educators who are doing this work and how they're having conversations with parents, all of the context of students and the demographics are a little bit different, and there are different implications and considerations for each. But what I do want to say is that invariably, there is not one educator that wants to do harm to their students. Not one. Not one. And there's this great study out there that looks at educators who, irrespective of their belief systems and what they personally believe, they know that in every class, there is at least one student who either does identify as LGBTQ+ or someday will. And they want to make sure that they do right by that student. And oftentimes it begins with trying to do right by that one student that creates a cascade of aha moments for others in that space. And so there's this, we oftentimes say that there's this chasm between education policymakers and the boots on the ground practitioners who are directly working with students and building relationships with students. And I can tell you in a hopeful regard that teachers find a way to get around the egregious bills and policies that are out there and meet students where they are.
Could you talk to us a little bit about what some of the work that you're doing looks like? So you mentioned in elementary school. How does this get introduced, and what kind of tools are you providing people with? Because I think when we say teaching LGBTQ stuff, that's a really big conversation. And I think, fairly, people say, well, how do you do this among different age groups? And one of the reminders that I always issue to people is chances are kids are having these conversations already, that we shouldn't act like we're bringing it to them. So could you talk a little bit about what kind of tools and resources you're bringing in and what that looks like?
Yeah, so for the elementary level, all of the LGBTQ inclusive content is, everything is anchored in primary sources. But for the elementary level, the primaries, it's anchored in illustrated stories based on primary sources. So for example, there's a unit that we have targeted for grade 3, looking at the Presidential Medal of Freedom and a variety of recipients that reflect the remarkable diversity of America. So we've got Sally Ride and John Lewis and Bayard Rustin and Wilma Mankiller. Who doesn't love that name, right? So
always have loved her.
Right. So it's reflecting a kind of a context. I hate to use, wonky terms, but it's a contextualized approach to show, not siloing LGBTQ identities, but, presenting them as part of a more accurate and complete reflection of who we are individually and also collectively.
I love that. I find when I'm teaching my little bits of history, we talk about how if you don't include pieces of people's identities, you don't get the whole story. And one of the examples that I use is Bayard Rustin and the March on Washington. Here was this man who was the machine behind organizing it. And unless you know the full context of his story, which was very difficult, you're missing a huge piece of history and a huge piece of civil rights history in the LGBTQ space too. So I think that's really, I think it's really exciting to think about this. I'm just interested, and I wonder if people in the chat might be interested in sharing this, what the first figure you learned about in school was as somebody who was LGBTQ. Because when I think about the first time in my formal education that I was taught about anyone who was LGBTQ was in college. That was the first time it formally came up in a classroom for me. And I think that is really profound. I wonder where other people's were, because unless it's proactively done, it doesn't happen that often, does it?
Right. We hear so often adult community members saying what a difference this would have made for them if they had had just one lesson in elementary school, in middle school, and high school. And oftentimes, if folks have been introduced to LGBTQ inclusive history, it was either incidentally or in college. I talked to someone recently, an adult community member, who was so angry that, and she's in her 60s now, that she did not understand why June was Pride Month until about 10 years ago.
Oh.
Yes, right?
Oh,
yes.
That just hurts to hear. That just hurts to hear that.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm looking in the chat right now and people are saying, a lot of people never learned anything. And Annette, you're not that old. Please stop saying that.
No, you're not that old. No.
You're not old. But I know mine was in college. I was lucky enough to be part of a pilot program for a lesbian fiction class. And it was amazing to me. Suddenly I got exposed to writers I had never heard of. It gave me a whole sense of possibility. But that was because I happened to be right place at the right time in an environment that was supporting that experience. And we're seeing a lot of people in the chat are saying there was nothing for them. So Deb, it is Pride Month. As we know, we are awash in rainbows everywhere that we look. Every place there is a rainbow. Every logo is rainbow. Everyone's a rainbow. And, I think during this month, it's exciting for a lot of people because it is the month that we are having these conversations, and there's so much more visibility, and there's so many more so many more discussions about the meaning of pride and the people who got us to where we are. But I want to know, what can people start doing to keep this conversation going? I mean, not everybody's a historian and not everybody's a teacher, but what do you think are some of the ways that our everyday activists, and at PFLAG, we are all everyday activists, can actually advance this discussion, whether we're looking at policy or sort of just in our everyday conversations that we have. What do you think?
Oh, so many ideas. So actually, we are all swimming in LGBTQ history, and oftentimes it's been invisible. Monuments, statues, it's really surrounding us everywhere. It's pervasive. It just needs to be unerased, which is what we're trying to do. And I would say to people, I know people are tired, exhausted from this past year, but I highly encourage, and actually I want to say this, in this moment, in this zeitgeist moment, we must center queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color, especially Black trans women. And if we don't, we're missing the mark. So in response to that question, I highly encourage everyone to find an organization, a group that supports Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans rights, and attend a meeting. Tell your friends you're doing that. Let other folks know in your circles that you want to have conversations about this, because that's where real change really begins. As Eleanor Roosevelt said so eloquently at the launch of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is where do human rights really begin? It's in the spaces that are so small they never appear on a map. And those are the conversations that we have with the person right next to us, a person across the hall, across the room, across the street. Yes. And follow history unerased.
Yes, and follow history unerased. But I think so much of that is happening right now. It's very interesting. Last year I was teaching a history class, and at the time that I was teaching, we got the Supreme Court decision, the Bostock decision that changed the interpretation of employment law. And it's at these very moments we are seeing this history just unfolding. Are there any particular resources that you really love? Obviously beyond History Unerased, but is there anything that you've been reading lately? I have to tell you, I recently started Sarah Schulman's book on ACT UP in New York City, and it is a fascinating history of a period of time that I existed in, but I was a little young to be involved at the time. And I feel like I am unearthing all of these connections to my own history presently, and names and characters that I didn't understand were in there. Are there any things that really jump to mind that you would love for people to start checking out? Because we do like giving people instructions here. We're very bossy at PFLAG.
Oh, I love it. So given the work that we do with History Unerased, we of course love primary sources. And if you go to the National Archives, Library of Congress, over the past 10 years or so, there are now search tools where you can look at the actual primary sources and learn from those. So National Archives, Library of Congress, National Park Service, there's a trove of information out there straight from the sources. And I highly recommend that.
You know, I was on the website for the British Museum the other night, and they have a special feature that you can tour online where it goes through their collections, and they have identified about 20 different pieces in the collection and established the LGBTQ content in them. And they were things that I've been there, I've seen a lot of it.
Yeah.
Walking through, I didn't know that that's what I was seeing, but stepping back and getting a chance to actually understand the context in which some of these objects existed absolutely blew my mind. I suddenly saw things that I just didn't even know it was there. We're seeing some people who are talking about, there's Jamie talking about the FX and Hulu series that was just released, and we are all big fans of Eric Marcus and history. Well,
I have to say, Eric is a dear friend and a colleague in this work. And for adults, Making Gay History, the podcast, is wonderful. We've also partnered with Eric to develop the Give Voice to History project, which are mini pods, as we call them, educationally relevant podcasts that anchors some of the content, our case studies, thematic units as part of our curriculum. But go to Making Gay History for the podcast. It is breathtaking and
it really
inspiring.
Is. You can hear interviews with our founder and with her son talking about how PFLAG came to be. Morty Manford talking about his mom. I think it was because of Eric Marcus's work that I then started pursuing all the things that Morty Manford did, which in his own right, he was a pretty tremendous activist who in some ways got a little overshadowed by his mom's work. As most people, kids understand.
Absolutely. We have a case study that's centered in that Give Voice to History Project podcast with Jean about the power of one individual to make change. And that's for the upper elementary level.
Excellent.
It's great.
Excellent. For parents, I would love to ask this question because we do have a lot of PFLAGers who are parenting school-age kids or have an influence in those conversations. What can parents do sort of very much at the school level, at the district level, if this stuff is not being taught? What are the kinds of questions that they should ask, and where should they be asking these questions? So how do they make it easier for History Unerased to do their work, frankly?
Yes, well, let me tell you, parents have tremendous power. Whether we're working with classroom teachers or school administrators or district leaders, parents are where the greatest fear of pushback is, but also where the greatest power is. Parents speaking up, caregivers, family members, calling up and asking for this goes a long, long way. And in fact, on our website, unerased.org, and the sidebar menu, there's a tab, how you can help. And there are suggestions there of, what you can say, reaching out to your schools and district leaders about bringing in a more inclusive curriculum.
And I'm going to ask one more question about that, because I know that one of the questions when I'm teaching that I often get, and even when I'm not teaching history, people are always asking us, how do I cue up this conversation with my kids? And the question we invariably get is, at what age should I start these conversations? Do you have any feedback about where these conversations should start? I mean, we know, I always like to point to children's literature gives parents a great inroad. And there's so much good stuff. But where would you say? Because I think a lot of parents legitimately don't know exactly where the line is.
Mm-hmm. My suggestion, honestly, and this is being informed by countless hours of conversations with experts who are invested in elementary education, social workers specializing in elementary education, mental health practitioners serving LGBTQ youth and their families from birth. Really. But literature is the vehicle. And we always talk about, the library story, that moment. I think everybody can relate to this. When you first see a piece of yourself, a core piece of your identity reflected in the book, in the text, in the stories that you're reading. And there are wonderful, my goodness, just at this point, happily, a trove of books to choose from to begin reading at an early age.
It's funny, as you said that, I immediately was thinking about the first time I found one of Liz Leah Newman's books, not her children's books, her books for adults. And it was the first time I saw myself, somebody who was writing about people like me and who looked like me and felt like me and saw the world like me. And I just remember thinking, this changes everything. I'm not the only one here. And and I was raised in a very inclusive, very progressive family, but to find her words, and it was on a library shelf, is where it all started for me. And it completely changed my life. And I will always be so very grateful for her. I actually got to meet her and completely melted down when we first encountered each other. And it was so much to me to think this woman who wrote these things that were just absolutely a lifeline for me. So as we are sort of in the middle of Pride Month, I think that we tend to get a lot of people really excited about it now, but it tends to die down a little bit as the months go on. We'll see another push during October, which is LGBTQ History Month. When people get some resistance to this, do you have any sort of basic resources or suggestions for parents? Because I know that resistance is also really intimidating. And sometimes when you're going into intellectual battle, it can feel pretty scary. When parents are being told that, this isn't necessary, or schools are really concerned it will cause too much controversy, what do you typically point to make the case?
That's such a great question. And 2 points I want to make in answering that question is, one component of the training that we do with teachers is to help them unpack the fear. And where is that fear coming from? And oftentimes, if there is fear, it's because of a perceived sense of loss. And to help maybe pose that question is what is that person afraid of losing? And helping to unpack where that's coming from, in a mindful, respectful way, but to hopefully to mitigate that fear. It's not a zero-sum game, but that the fact is, the simple fact, undeniable fact, that our children are surrounded by LGBT topics everywhere, in pop culture, in current legislation, in the media, in politics, everywhere. And unless they have the opportunity to have academic content that helps them understand the path and progression of those topics, the bullying and violence and discrimination will continue.
I have to tell you, as you were speaking and you said it's not a zero-sum game, that is exactly where my head was. But I really appreciated the way you phrased that and the way you framed it, that I think there is a lot of fear for many reasons. But one is this sense of, if I start introducing this, then what is going to have to come out? And I think people need to flip that narrative and realize this isn't about taking something else out of curriculum. This is about adding to and making a more vibrant curriculum that gives us so much more insight into what actually happened and how we should actually understand it. It's more exciting that way. But I think acknowledging that fear, I would have never really thought about it that way. And so thank you for that. I'm going to really keep that one in mind. So I have to ask you, Deb, you're doing this work. I want to know, when was the first time you encountered LGBTQ content in education? Did it ever come into sort of your educational pathway, or was this something that became your mission after seeing what it's like to go through without it?
I never, not once, ever, even in grad school, never, not once. But when I was teaching and working with new immigrants and refugee populations, anyway, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but let's just say I internalized the voices of students and other colleagues and others around me to understand that our system, we have many systems that are in need of repair. But one system, and I don't think people often think about curriculum as a system, but it is. It is an operating system. And that system, if it is not inclusive of everyone, is infected. I'll just say that. And so that the power of that system in showing all young people their place in the world and their capacity to contribute to the world by looking back so that we can then look forward.
I love that. Growing up, my father actually wrote a curriculum for Puerto Rican history because he recognized that the system where we lived was lacking in, and there were so many students who were growing up not knowing anything about where they came from, and so it was necessary. And so I really do respect this idea of it is a system, and it's a system that we can influence, and we influence both when we add things to it, but we're also influencing it when we don't do anything, and when we allow things like what happened in Tennessee to pass. And I think that Tennessee example really does, in fact, give us something to look at and something to pay attention to. And I think for anyone who's watching today, paying attention to what happens in your state, even if you're living in a great big progressive state, nothing is safe. No progress is safe anymore. You made the point when we started, Deb, that we've got over 140 bills. It's 33 states now, and most of them are targeted against trans folks, non-binary folks, and especially against youth. And that is a really scary place to be. Deb, thank you so much. This was such a treat. I'm so excited that I got to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Once again, let people know how they can find you online.
Yes, you can go to unerased.org, unerased.org. Copious information there. You can follow us on Twitter, HISTUNERASD. And thank you all for those who are attending. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deb. And please, 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 when you have new things to tell us about, let us know, because we would love to help amplify the work that you're doing. It is so important. No kid should go through school the way we did.
Absolutely.
Everyone deserves better. So thank you so much, and happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride Month. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Well, that gets us to the end of another show, another rainbowy show. Just a reminder, we will be back next week. We have got a great set of programs planned for you for all of Pride Month, so you definitely want to tune in. As we say at the end of every single show, every single week, we encourage you to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. And please, if you haven't done it yet, please go get vaccinated. We will see you next week on Something to Talk About. Bye, everyone.